Okay, we are going to be looking at the third of the churches that Jesus dictated letters to in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. This one is the church of Pergamos. I think the King James says Pergamum, but it is Pergamum and Pergamos are both different forms of the same name. Modern translations usually say Pergamos, so I assume that that's the more modern way of speaking of that town. So let me just read this letter, and we'll go through and talk about it. Verse 12 through 17. And to the angel of the church in Pergamos write, "These things says he who has a sharp two-edged sword. I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. And you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. Thus you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Repent, or else I will come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat, and I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it." And there's that letter. Now, Pergamos was more important in Asia Minor than one might think, or the province of Asia. Remember, Asia, where all these churches are, is the landmass of today is occupied by the country of Turkey. So if you're picturing geographically where they're all in the country of Turkey today. And of course, Turkey is very Muslim. There's not so many Christians in Turkey. The churches that are written to here are, for the most part, not there anymore. In some cases, even the cities aren't there anymore. Pergamos is the oldest city, or in that time, it was the oldest city in the region, in Asia. And it was an important city to the Romans. It was the capital of the province. So to that region, Pergamos would be like what Washington, D.C. is to us in America. Ephesus, the church to which the first letter was written, was more like the New York City of that area. But Pergamos was like the Roman capital of that province. And so there was a strong Roman presence there, obviously. There were Roman troops there. It was a very Caesar-oriented culture there. In fact, Pergamos was the first of all these churches in Asia, of all the cities in Asia, to actually have a temple to Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was the Caesar when Jesus was born, as you might recall. And this would now be maybe a century, nearly a century later, not quite. So maybe 3/4. And they had built a temple to Caesar Augustus, who was worshipped there, apparently as a god, as the Caesars often were. It was also the first city in Asia to build a temple to Zeus, and there was sort of a conical-shaped hill outside this town that had quite a few pagan temples in it, and there was one altar to Zeus that was kind of shaped like a throne. And some think that he says where Satan's throne is might be referring to this actual throne-shaped altar to Zeus that was on this hill. There's other reasons to think it might be, seen as the throne of Satan. He also refers to it as, at the end of verse 13, where Satan dwells. This city is where Satan dwells. They had a temple they'd built there to Asclepius, the Greek god who was the god of healing. And there are reportedly, miracle healings that took place there. It was kind of like, I don't know if you're familiar with Lourdes in France, but in Lourdes, France, in the 1800s, there was an alleged appearance of the Virgin Mary, and people started going there, and people started getting healed of sicknesses, and it became sort of a place for people all over the world to go to Lourdes if they wanted to get healed. And Pergamos was sort of like that. The temple of Asclepius. Actually, You know the symbol of the American Medical Association, the pole with two snakes on it? That's from the legend of Asclepius. That Asclepius was given a fruit that would promote healing by a serpent in the mythology, which sounds a little bit like a true story that we know of. But anyway, this Asclepius was a serpent god of healing. And by the way, I didn't know this until I was an adult, but we've heard a lot about the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. It begins by saying, I swear by Asclepius and all the gods and goddesses that, and then that's how the oath proceeds. And even in America, I don't know if doctors always say the Hippocratic Oath anymore, but that used to be customary, that you, in the medical profession, you even post it on your wall. I looked at it more closely one time on the wall of the doctor, and I was surprised he swore by Asclepius. What do you do? So the medical profession has always had, issues of kind of being rivals to God in some respects, but although there's godly medical people too, obviously. But Asclepius' temple was there in Pergamos, and miracles of healing were apparently done there, demonic miracles, I assume. And therefore, that might be why Jesus said, this is where Satan's power, where Satan's throne is. This is where Satan dwells. So I don't know if the reference is to this occult phenomena that was going on in Pergamos, or if it's a reference to the Roman presence, because of course the Roman emperor was worshipped as a god also. So both would be satanic alternatives to the true God. Jesus therefore describes himself as he who has a sharp two-edged sword when he introduces himself. These things says he who has a sharp two-edged sword. Sword, the sword of Rome was in that city. In fact, there had even been a martyr. Antipas had been slain, probably by the Romans. Jesus reminds his church that he's the one with the sharp sword that people ought to be afraid of, not Rome's. Jesus said, don't be afraid of those who can kill the body and can do no more, but fear him who, after he's killed the body, can cast the soul into Gehenna. I kind of mixed Gehenna and Hades there for a moment. But in Gehenna, he said there. And so, they've had a martyr. They're the only church, as far as we know, that has had a martyr in their church. And probably, since this was a Roman capital and the Roman sword was prominent there as a law enforcement arm, possibly Antipas was a man who refused to honor the Caesar as he was expected to and was put to death. Now, we don't know anything about Antipas. There are some old church traditions about Antipas, but we don't know that they have any merit. So most commentators say we know nothing about him, except that his name is mentioned here as a martyr who had been martyred there. But Jesus refers to himself as the one who has the sharp sword, which would be perhaps intentionally contrasting with the Roman sword, saying, you worry about swords, worry about my sword, Also, of course, the way that Jesus described himself to these churches, at least in the earlier letters, are descriptions drawn from chapter 1, where Jesus was seen with eyes of a flame of fire and feet of bronze and a sword coming out of his mouth, sharp two-edged sword. So this too is, borrowing from that vision of Christ, a feature that is applicable to this particular church's local circumstances and concern. In fact, in mentioning the sword and that he has it, it comes into play also in the verse 16 where he says, repent or else I will come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. It's kind of interesting how when he wrote to the Ephesian church, he described himself in the same chapter in verse 1. It says, these things says he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands, which is again from the description of Jesus in the previous chapter, in chapter 1. But at the end of it, he threatens whoever doesn't repent, he says, I'll remove your lampstand from its place. So he introduced himself as the one who's walking among the lampstands, and his threat to those who won't repent is that their lampstand won't be where he's walking anymore. He won't be walking with them. And now he's threatening the rebels in the church in Pergamos that he'll fight with them with his sword. Whatever form that would take, we don't know. That church is gone now, so it apparently has been defeated. Whether it repented and had a longer 10 years before it was destroyed, I don't know. But most of these churches, I think, have been defeated by Islam, frankly, sometime centuries ago. In any case, this church had a believing community that was faithful even under such persecution as had resulted in one of their being a martyr. Antipas might have been a leader of the church, because when the Romans did persecute Christian churches, they usually selected the leaders to make an example of them and took them and whatever they did, fed them to the lions, cut their heads off, or whatever. So it's possible that Antipas had been a church leader, though we're not told that. He may have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's interesting that Antipas is actually referred to in verse 13 as my faithful martyr. Or at least that's how it's translated into English. The word martyr is the same Greek word as the word witness. It's interesting because it's the older use of it was simply someone who bore testimony. Someone who bore witness was a martyr, which is the Greek word. And in time, it came to evolve in its meaning to be somebody who bore witness even unto death, someone who died for their witness. And so we know the word martyr to have those connotations. If someone's a martyr, we usually mean someone who died faithful. And but what's interesting is this expression, my faithful martyr, is the exact same expression in the Greek as that which Jesus referred to himself as, though it's translated in chapter 1, verse 5 as the faithful witness, which is, again, the same Greek word. In Revelation 1:5, it says, from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness. That's the same expression in the Greek as Antipas, my faithful martyr, which is really quite a flattery when you think about it, that Jesus would use the same epithet for this faithful martyr as he uses of himself. I'm the faithful witness. Antipas is my faithful witness. Jesus identifies with his people such that, he shares his honor with those who are faithful to him unto death. He said to the previous church, Smyrna, which we covered last time, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. But he also gives them a title, that's his own title, the faithful witness, which is a pretty lofty honor, it seems to me. He likes the church in that respect. I know your works, he says, where you dwell where Satan's throne is, which means you've got more of a challenge than some churches might, and yet you hold fast to my name. You do not deny my name, even in the days when Antipas was my faithful martyr or witness, who is killed among you, where Satan dwells. He says, but I have a few things against you. Now, the things he has against them is that they are overly tolerant of certain doctrines that the church should not tolerate. It's hard to know sometimes how many doctrines that are not correct should be tolerated in the church, because frankly, many good Christians have honestly differing opinions, and therefore their doctrines on many things are not exactly like each other. And the Bible does not encourage us to split off from other Christians who have slightly different ways of seeing things. When Paul wrote to the Romans, there were some church in the church who kept one day holy and others kept every day alike. There were some there who believed that Christians should not eat meat and they ate only vegetables, but others ate whatever they wanted to. Now, this kind of thing can cause division. I mean, imagine if we in this fellowship had some people who were, let's just say they were Torah observant, and they wouldn't eat anything and didn't think any Christian should eat anything that the Jews consider unclean. And they also felt like, a certain day of the week should be a holy day, and the rest of us didn't think so. That wouldn't have to be a problem. But there'd probably be tension eventually especially because of those who had the stricter rule. Those who are Torah observant and think everyone should be, would be frequently offended by those Christians who don't share their opinion that you have to be so strict and so Judaistic. And that's what the Roman church had going on, both groups. And instead of dividing into different fellowships, Paul said, just let everyone be fully persuaded in his own mind. Paul felt that the churches should not divide over even things like that. But there are things they should divide over. Now, the things churches usually divide over, as far as doctrines are concerned, are often doctrines that are what we'd call theological positions, like Calvinism and Arminianism are different theological positions. Trinitarianism and oneness Pentecostals have different opinions theologically. Certainly, people who believe in a future millennium and those who don't, that's a different theological opinion. None of those theological opinions directly affect the way you live your life. But those are the kinds of things that churches get uptight about if you don't agree with them, these theological opinions. Now, when the Bible talks about doctrine, and here we have reference to the doctrine of Balaam and the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, these are the doctrines they're not allowed to have. These apparently are not so much theological positions as moral positions. When Jesus talked about church discipline, he said, if your brother sins against you, not if your brother has a different opinion than you have. Sin is an issue that the church is not to tolerate. Sin is, we forgive it if it's forgiven. If someone repents, of course we forgive. We don't kick people out of the church when they sin. We should kick people out of the church when they have sinned and been confronted and don't repent. They've been confronted again by two and they don't repent. They're confronted again by the whole church and they don't repent. Well, then you kick them out. But what Jesus described is over sin, not opinion. And I believe that Paul, and I believe Jesus too, is not so offended by someone who honestly has reached a different opinion about something that's abstract. All the doctrines I mentioned a moment ago, Trinitarianism, Calvinism, Arminianism, eschatology, those are rather abstract doctrines in the sense that they don't really have a direct impact on the way you live. They might. Anyone can react to those doctrines in such a way that makes them sloppy or careful in their moral life, but those doctrines in themselves can be held one way or the other on each of those issues and still have people living conscientiously for Christ in holy lives. And when Paul talked about doctrine, he actually was talking about teachings about moral behavior. And you can see this, for example, if I can quickly find it. I had not known I was going to bring it up, but look at, I think, Titus chapter 2, I believe. Let's see here. Titus chapter 2, verse 1. Paul said, but as for you, speak the things which are proper to sound doctrine. Now again, our natural tendency is to think doctrine means theology, because that's usually what we refer to when we talk about different doctrinal differences, means theological differences. But the word doctrine is just an old English word that means teaching. The Greek word that is behind it is simply teaching. Teaching. It might be teaching about theology, it might be teaching about moral behavior. In Paul's mind, sound teaching is teaching that is about behavior, not abstractions. And that's not surprising because Jesus told the disciples, go and make disciples and teach them. He didn't say teach them abstractions, he said teach them to observe everything I've commanded. So the teaching ministry of the church, the doctrine of the church, is that Jesus is Lord and people need to be taught to obey him as Lord. And so Paul says to Titus, as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound teaching. And look what he calls sound teaching, that older men be sober, reverent, self-controlled. That's what the word temperate means. Sound in faith, in love, and in patience. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. Likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded. This is sound doctrine. There's not a word there about theological concepts. It's about be sober, don't be given to wine, don't be gossips. It's talking about how to live. Sound doctrine, or for that matter, unsound doctrine, present alternative ways of advocacy of how one is to live. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I may be thinking of, wait here. Yeah, I think it's 1 Timothy. I get a little mixed up sometimes between whether a passage is in 1st or 2nd Timothy because they have so much of the same kind of material in them. Here it is. Yeah, 1 Timothy 1, verse 9. Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless, insubordinate, the ungodly, for the sinners, for the unholy, profane, murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, manslayers, for fornicators, sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and if there's any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine. Now notice he says these are the things that are contrary to sound teaching. Every one of them has to do with moral behavior. You know, he's not talking about, you know, they don't have the right eschatology. He's talking about they kill their moms and their dads, they kidnap, they rape, they murder, they fornicate, they're liars. These are the things that are contrary to sound doctrine. So when we find complaints about bad doctrine in the New Testament, more often than not, it's talking about people teaching that it's okay to sin. One way or another, they're teaching that. Now, last night, I talked to a Christian couple that we know pretty well, and they've just been in their church or youth group or somewhere, they've been through a video series, which I won't name the teacher in it, but he was saying that it doesn't matter how you live. You just believe in Jesus, and you can live. The words they said, that you can live a totally selfish life if you want to. Well, the young people love to hear that. Unfortunately, it's not the gospel. It's false doctrine. To tell people they can sin if they want to, and it's okay because they're saved by grace, is what we call the hyper grace teaching, and it's error. It's very much like the teaching that was going on in Pergamos, because the false teaching in Pergamos was saying that people could practice idolatry, they could fornicate. That's bad doctrine. That's the doctrine of Balaam. Now, it's referring to the doctrine of Balaam. You remember Balaam from the book of Numbers. He was not actually a Jew, but he had some kind of prophetic reputation, probably a fortune teller or something like that, or some kind of a sage. And Balak, the king of the Moabites wanted to curse Israel because he was terrified of them as they were moving into his territory. They weren't really threatening him, but he felt threatened because they were powerful. And so he hired Balaam to curse Israel. And Balaam was unable to do it, as it turns out. He tried several times, but God's Spirit would get a hold of him, and every time he wanted to curse Israel, blessings for Israel came out. And so Balak, who hired him, was very upset because he's paying him to curse them, and instead he's blessing them. And so we end the story of Balaam in Numbers hearing nothing more about what happened. He went to his house and didn't curse Israel. But later in Numbers, like totally separated almost by nearly 10 chapters from the story of Balaam, we read something in chapter 31 of Numbers about Balaam. Something that had not been mentioned, but we see that Moses is angry at his own soldiers because they did not kill some of the Moabite women who came in and seduced Israel and led them into idolatry. And he says in Numbers 31, look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incident of Baal Peor, and there was plague among the congregation of the Lord. Now, that's the first time we learned that there had been some counsel given by Balaam, apparently to Balak. When he found himself unable to curse the people because God wouldn't let him, he apparently counseled Balaam, well, I know how to get their own God to curse them. Get them to worship idols, get them to get involved in temple prostitution, send some of your most seductive women in the camp and seduce the men and lead them into idolatry. And so Balak did that under the counsel of Balaam. Now, it doesn't say here that that's what the counsel of Balaam was, but it says that these women had seduced the men of Israel into idolatry at Baal Peor, where there was also fornication and idolatry both involved, and that they had done it through the counsel of Balaam. So the book of Revelation, Jesus says, Balaam gave counsel to Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. So there in Revelation 2:14, it's alluding to kind of a obscure statement in Numbers 31:16 about how Balaam had given that counsel. Now that means that the ones who were teaching the doctrine of Balaam were doing the same thing. They were bringing fornication and idolatry, or compromise in those areas, into the church and apparently advocating it, or at least giving permission for it. So it'd be very much like the teachers today who say, as long as you believe in Jesus, don't worry. Don't worry about limiting your life and holding back your impulses. You're saved by grace. If you're saved by grace, feel free to do what you want to do. And if you want to go feast in the idol temples with the pagans, if you want to go sleep with the temple prostitutes, or you want to fornicate, you want to do anything bad, it's okay. You can do that. And that's what apparently the counsel of Balaam was. Now it's interesting, he calls it the doctrine of Balaam, but I don't think it's saying that the people called themselves, we're followers of Balaam. I think that's what Jesus calls them. Just like he's going to call in the next church, Thyatira, he's going to call a woman in the church Jezebel. And she was also teaching the church to fornicate and practice idolatry. So you can see that there are Old Testament precedents for people corrupting Israel with idolatry and fornication. One was Balaam, one was Jezebel. But almost certainly there was not a woman in the church of Thyatira whose real name was Jezebel. That's like a code name that Jesus gives her to point out that she's very much like Jezebel in the Old Testament. Likewise, I'm sure these people who are teaching this doctrine, we're not saying this is Balaam's doctrine, but what Jesus is saying, it is Balaam's. It's the same doctrine by which Balaam corrupted the Israelites. These teachers are corrupting you. Now, in all likelihood, the doctrine they called it was the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. Now, it's hard to tell because both are mentioned in verse 14, and it sounds like they may be different doctrines. But he doesn't actually say what the doctrine of the Nicolaitans was, what the Nicolaitans were teaching. We do remember, though, that earlier when Jesus wrote to the church of Ephesus, he mentioned there were people in the church who had come to them who practiced the deeds of the Nicolaitans. That's in Revelation 2, verse 6. This you have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. So Jesus hates the deeds of the Nicolaitans, and that fortunately the church of Ephesus was intolerant of them too. But in the church of Pergamos, it wasn't so good. The Nicolaitans have been there too. It doesn't mention their deeds, but their teachings. And he says, which I hate. So both times that Jesus mentions the Nicolaitans, their deeds and their teachings, he hates their deeds and he hates their teachings. Unfortunately, this church didn't hate them. Now, we're not ever told what the teaching of the Nicolaitans was. But when we covered the church of Ephesus some months ago, I mentioned that the church fathers were very clear on what the doctrine of the Nicolaitans was. First of all, they believed it was a heresy and a cult, we might say, that had been followers of Nicholas, hence the name Nicolaitans. They're followers of a man named Nicholas. The church fathers actually said this Nicholas was the same Nicholas we read about in Acts chapter 6, when the 7, what we usually call deacons, were appointed to distribute the food in Jerusalem. There are 7 names. Stephen was on that list. Philip was on that list. Some other unknown guys were on it. But the last one named was Nicholas the proselyte. And according to the church fathers in the 2nd century, they said the Nicolaitans, they are followers of Nicholas, the proselyte from that 7. So it would appear that Nicholas may have, if the church fathers are right, may have fallen away, may have started a cult. The general impression you get from the church fathers, it was a Gnostic kind of a move on his part. And Gnosticism, especially the antinomian branch of Gnosticism, taught that it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how you live. You can sin all you want as long as you have the knowledge of the truth. And again, that's not very different than what we'd have to call antinomianism. Anti means against, and nomian comes from the Greek word nomos, which is law, against law. They're against having any rules. They're basically saying it's wrong to have rules. We're saved by grace. You're saved by knowledge of God. You're not saved by rules, so don't worry about it. That's what the antinomians teach. That was a Gnostic heresy. We see very specifically that's what the teaching of Balaam was. And it may well be that what what the teachers themselves called themselves were Nicolaitans. Jesus is saying, well, that's what they call themselves, but I'm calling them Balaam. You know, they're teaching the same thing Balaam taught. So the important thing for us to note is that we do have this kind of teaching in some churches today in America, evangelical churches. Some churches don't teach it so baldly and so openly as that. I was raised in a regular evangelical denominational church that never said it's okay to go out and fornicate and worship idols or anything like that. But they did teach salvation by grace in such a way that they never gave the impression that there's any moral obligation on us. You know, we're not saved by works. And I knew many people in the church, my age, I was a youngster when I was in that church, a teenager. And I knew many of them that lived sinful lives and just assumed, well, what's the matter? We're not saved by works, we're saved by grace. And so it wasn't as if the church was advocating bad behavior. It's just that they weren't making it very clear that bad behavior can't be going on if you're saved by grace. You see, some people see it as a difference between, you know, we're saved by grace or we're saved into a life of good works. We are saved into a life of good works. That's what Paul said in Titus. We've seen it before. He said, the grace of God, which brings salvation to all, has appeared, teaching us that forsaking ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly and godly in this present world. That's what grace teaches us, Paul said. The grace of God has come and taught us this. Grace teaches us to live godly, to forsake worldliness and ungodly lust. So salvation by grace doesn't mean, okay, you're saved by grace, now you can live ungodly. Not if you have grace. Grace will teach you not to do that. If grace comes into your life, the grace of God teaches you to live soberly, godly, forsaking worldly lusts. So the person who says, well, I can live ungodly because I'm saved by grace, I think, well, what kind of grace are you saved by? Not the grace the Bible talks about. You don't have any grace in your life if it isn't teaching you to live godly. So how can you be saved by grace if it's not there? It's not there in your life. And I was teaching for a while last week and trying to get across this harmony of being saved by grace through faith on the one hand, and being required to do good works on the other. And I was mentioning that, you know, if you want to join the military, they don't charge you to join. At least I'm pretty sure they don't. They pay you to join. You don't. When my grandson signed up to be in the Marines, they didn't say, well, that'll cost you $2,000 to join. No, you can join for free. But once you've joined, you're in. And what you're in is a highly disciplined, restricted kind of a society, the military. You know, you don't choose where you're going to live now. You don't choose what you're going to eat or when. You don't choose how you're going to dress. I mean, you don't choose what time you get up in the morning or what you do when you're up. I mean, you now, it's like what Paul said in 2 Timothy 2, verses 3 and 4. He said to Timothy, endure hardship like a good soldier of Jesus Christ. He says, no one who goes to war, you know, entangles himself in the affairs of this world so that he might please him who enlisted him to be a soldier. So it doesn't cost anything to become a soldier, but it's a described life of obedience. Same thing of being born into your family. Your parents brought you into the world. You didn't have to pay an entrance fee. You were saved you were born by their works, not yours. But you were born into a family. And a family is something. It's something that has parents. It has children. There are roles. There's obedience to the parents required. Honoring the parents is required. It's not that you become a child by obeying. It's that you obey because you have become a child. And that's what it means. You get saved, you've got a father now. You've got a king now. You're in the army now. Now, of course, it's a very liberating thing because it's not as if we're giving up a life of freedom and now we're in this lockdown under a commander and don't have your freedom anymore, because we didn't have freedom before. We just thought we did. You're either a slave of the devil or you're a slave of Christ. And Christ is Jesus said, the Son sets you free. Paul said, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. Because your heart is changed, you do what you want to do, but what your spirit wants, not what your flesh wants. Your flesh still wants all the other things you had before, but you now have an inward spirit, the Spirit of God, who makes you want to please God. If you don't have that, if that grace has not come and it's not inwardly teaching you that you want to serve God, then I think you need to ask yourself whether you've been born again, whether you really have the Spirit of God, whether you really have grace. Because someone who really does, they get in for free and we stay in for free. We don't stay children of God by obeying him. We don't obtain or maintain our relationship to God by our good works. Just like my children didn't become my children or remain my children by obeying me. Good thing too, because they didn't always obey very well. But they were born into a society, our family, which has certain roles to play. And when we're born into the kingdom of God, there's a role to play when you have a king. I don't mean a stage role or a play. I'm talking about a role in a society. Jesus is the king. If you are in his kingdom, you've received grace, and that grace teaches you to obey the king. And that's an inward teaching. It's not an outward law that's put upon us. It's an inward transformation, so that we have this dynamic and it's saying, wow, how can I please my king? I want to please my king. That's what my life is all about now, is pleasing my king. So, I mean, when someone says, well, you're saved by grace, but you can still live as selfishly as you want, as apparently some preacher was so bold as to say not too long ago, they're basically saying you're saved by grace, but you don't need grace. Because if you have grace, you won't be living as selfishly as you do.
Do you know what denomination he was from?
He was not so much associated with the denomination as he was a popular author. I mean, he probably goes to some church, but I don't. He's not representing the views of any particular denomination, though there are no doubt denominational churches that would be on board.
Would it just be like Chuck Swindoll or something like that?
It was not Chuck Swindoll. It was someone less well known, probably to people who listen to the radio. This guy had a real popular book years ago. Well, I would want to give his name, but the only reason I don't is because I don't. If they misrepresented his teaching to me, if they were paraphrasing it, and he didn't say it quite so boldly, I don't want that teaching to be associated with his name. I would have to hear him say it myself before I would feel comfortable doing that. But they watched the film series by this guy. The book he wrote was several years ago popular, and his name is not a household word, even among Christians. But he had a best-selling book at one time. So this is really what antinomian is. Nowadays they call it hyper grace or something like that. And by the way, it is mostly found among dispensationalists, but not all dispensationalists believe it. For example, John MacArthur is is a dispensationalist, but he's not a believer in this hyper grace. John MacArthur wrote a very good book called The Gospel According to Jesus, where he took to task his fellow dispensationalists who were preaching this super grace doctrine. So, I mean, there's some good dispensationalists who realize this is bad stuff, but it is nonetheless among dispensationalists that this has arisen. And the reason it can is because they believe we're in a dispensation of grace, which is different than the dispensation of the kingdom. That's essentially what dispensationalism teaches. And that all that strict teaching of Jesus, that was for the kingdom dispensation, but that was postponed when Jesus was rejected by the Jews, and it'll come back when he comes back. So, but in the meantime, we're in this grace dispensation, and they say under grace, it's not like the obedience that Jesus was preaching. It's no works. But they don't realize that. I mean, they do say Paul's teachings belong to the present grace dispensation, but Paul, he came down heavy on all kinds of sin. The fornicator in Corinth, he said, kick him out of the church. He doesn't, you can't have that kind of leaven in the church. And I mean, most of Paul's teaching in his letters, or at least half of it, is telling people how to live and how to live holy. Because that's what the apostles were commissioned to teach people to observe all things Jesus commanded. So to say that, the commands of Jesus belong to a different dispensation than this one, well, how were the apostles supposed to work that out? He told them to teach everyone to do everything Jesus commanded. And yet they're in a different dispensation from Jesus where keeping Jesus' commands isn't required. This is a confused theological system, very much, a very confused theological system. But there are some people in it who think more clearly than others. And while I have my differences, quite a few, with John MacArthur, I think I can commend him for not running with the pack, as it were, on that particular issue. Because that's a doctrine God hates. Jesus said he hates it. He hates their deeds. He hates their doctrines. Then he says in verse 15, thus you have also those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Repent, that is, of those doctrines, or else I will come to you quickly, and I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. It's interesting that Jesus would argue he'd come and fight against members of the church, and not wrestling, but armed combat. He has a sword, and that looks like it's a pretty deadly engagement if Jesus comes and fights and uses a sword. Now, of course, the sword coming out of Jesus' mouth represents his words and truth and so forth. So, I mean, it may not be a slaughter such as we think of, with a sword coming and punishing and warring against these people. It may be that his truth would come and displace the falsehood of these people, and they'd lose their place in the church, perhaps. That's certainly a possibility. It doesn't say exactly what this fighting against them with the sword from his mouth looks like, but could well be a spiritual battle of truth.
It's kind of the whole idea of God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
Right.
When you oppose somebody, you stand against them.
Yeah, and you don't want to be having the person who opposes you be God. You know, you got to pick your enemies, and he's not the one you want to pick, obviously. All right, so, and then verse 17, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Once again, each letter is written to an individual church, but each one closes. But Jesus said, you need to listen to what I'm saying to all these churches. And that's because there are many churches, not just this one, that need to hear this particular message. And they need to hear messages that are given to other churches too. To him who overcomes, now remember all the letters end with a promise to the one who overcomes or who conquers. This idea of conquering or overcoming is defined for us in Revelation 12:11, where it says of the church in their warfare against Satan, he who overcomes. It says they overcame. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, the word of their testimony, and did not love their lives to the death. When Jesus was about to die and determined to go through with it, he said to the disciples, these things I've spoken to you, that in me you'll have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. That is all the efforts of the world and the prince of this world, Satan, to corrupt him, to turn him back, to intimidate him. He beat all those. He made it to the end, and he's faithfully dying, as his Father's calling him to do. And so, you know, those who overcome Satan do so by not loving their lives to the death. To be faithful unto death, as it says in chapter 2, verse 10 of Revelation, be faithful to death, and I'll give you the crown of life. That's the overcomer. And so, anyone who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat. Now, the hidden manna may refer to a well-known Jewish tradition that before Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, that Jeremiah the prophet somehow had access to the ark, and he snuck it out of the temple before it was destroyed. And when he and other Jews went to Egypt, they took the ark with them. And it's never been heard from since. But the Jew rabbis had come up with the idea that before, when the Messianic age is beginning, Jeremiah will reappear, and he'll have with him the golden pot of manna that was in the Ark of the Covenant. And he will miraculously feed the nation with this manna when he comes. The rabbis had a lot of kind of unusual ideas. But that's no doubt why when Jesus fed the multitudes, the people said, oh, this is the prophet who is supposed to come. And a few days later at Caesarea Philippi, Jesus said to the disciples, who do people say I am? They said, well, some say you're John the Baptist or Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. They thought perhaps he was the one feeding. He's Jeremiah, fulfilling that tradition. And so I will give to you the hidden manna. There was some manna hidden in the golden pot in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, so he might be alluding to that custom. The Messiah is going to feed us from the hidden manna in the golden pot in the ark. Of course, he's not talking about literal manna. Remember in John chapter 6, the Jews said to Jesus, Moses gave us bread from heaven, meaning manna. What are you going to give us? And Jesus said, I'm the bread of heaven that comes down. Moses didn't give it to you. My Father gives you the bread of heaven. That's me. You have to eat my flesh, drink my blood. So he's saying, I'll give you myself. You'll be nourished by your intimate relationship with me. If you overcome, you may lose your life, but you will have me still. I'll give to eat of this manna. And it may be mentioned in this way in this letter in contrast to the festivals and the feasts that were held in all the idolatrous temples. One of the most popular public events in any pagan city was the public feasts, where they had to dispense with meat that was remnants of what the idols had received. I mean, they burned some of the idols, the rest was eaten by the community. So they had these big feasts, and there was a lot of controversy in the early church whether Christians could eat at these feasts or not. But it's very clear that Jesus didn't want them eating at these feasts, because he said that the doctrine he hates is that they could eat things sacrificed to idols. That'd be, participating in these feasts. So it may be they're saying, if you resist those temptations, if you avoid eating in those feasts, and you might say, why would that be such a great temptation? I could easily avoid going to a public feast to an idol. But you have to remember, these people lived in that city all their lives before they were Christians. Those were one of the main social events in their lives until they became Christians, and they were probably adult converts. So they had plenty of friends at those feasts. They had plenty of memories of those feasts. They were probably great times of celebration, drunkenness, fornication. And so that was their temptation. He says, well, if you overcome that and you don't succumb to that, I'll give you a better feast. I'll let you eat the hidden manna, which no one else gets to eat except overcomers. And he says, and I will give that person a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. Now, this white stone with which the letter ends, with reference, is very much discussed by commentators as to what it refers to. And there are three primary opinions that I have encountered. All of them make sense. It's not probable that all of them are implied in this, but it's hard to know which one is, but any one of them makes sense. One is that they say, and again, I get this from commentators, I'm not an expert on Roman history to know if this is really the way things were done in the courts. They say that in a court of law, if you were the one on trial, the judge would customarily hand down a stone, probably wrapped so you couldn't see what color it was, to the accused. And it was a judgment it was the verdict. And if he opened it, it was a black stone, he was condemned. If it was a white stone, he was acquitted. So the judge hands down a white stone to the person who's not guilty. And so receiving a white stone from God would be like saying, he sees you as not guilty. He's justified you. You're acquitted. And that would be a very true meaning. I mean, if that is in fact what they did, commentators have said that would make sense. That would be a good meaning. It would certainly fit the overall picture of what Christianity teaches. There's another theory that some commentators present, and they say that in the Olympic Games in the ancient times, they'd have all the runners run their races, then they would reward them at the end with their, whoever won would receive a crown. But they didn't do it until the end of the ceremony. And so when each runner would finish his race, if he won, he'd be given a white stone, which was like a token. He'd later trade that in for the crown or for the wreath. So when all the runners have run, they all bring in their white stones, they get their wreath. So it'd be like saying, you're someday going to be crowned, reigning with me, but if you as an overcomer, until that date comes, I'll give you a white stone, more or less a token that you have won a race and that you are going to receive a crown eventually here. That's an interesting concept also, and quite fitting of a Christian, template. I think more often than not, I've heard commentators suggest that the white stone served in many ancient cities as something like a pass into a feast, like a ticket. Ticket to a concert, a ticket to an event, a ticket to a pagan feast to go in and eat. And that a white stone would serve as a token, a pass, like a backstage pass or something, you know. And so they say that if you overcome, I'm going to give you a white stone with your name on it. Now, so you may be denying yourself access to pagan feasts, but you'll have a pass to my feast. You know, you'll be accepted. So white stones, obviously, it's not explained here what it means. There's certain customs of ancient times that it might refer to. Several of them would make equally good sense. I don't think probably the statement refers to all those things, although maybe it does, but one of them probably is the meaning of it. He does say that the white stone will have a new name written on it, which is not known except to the one who receives it. Now, it's not really clear whether it's saying the name on the stone will be your new name, and God's going to give you a new name and no one will know it but you. Or if he's saying, my name is on it, and everyone who receives it will know it. Everyone who receives it will recognize him. That those who overcome will all receive stones with his name on them. I'm not saying that's what it means. It's a little unclear, although we do know that in Revelation 14, all of God's people are seen as having God's name on their forehead. And there's also another time when Jesus said that everyone who overcomes, to another church, he said he'll give them a new name and the name of the New Jerusalem or something like as the city of their citizenship. So there's certain kinds of allusions here that we can't really nail down, but they obviously refer to special privilege being accepted by him, being congratulated by him, having won victory that he acknowledges, and this stone is the way of his giving an emblem of that fact. Now, there's probably, I don't believe there's any literal white stones going to be given out by Jesus. These are all symbolic ways of talking about things. And yet the concept is that, you know, you may go the way of Antipas, my faithful martyr. You may be hated, you might be excluded even from the company of those in these feasts, but you'll be included in the feast, the only feast that will really ever matter. And you'll eat the hidden manna that others are not allowed to eat. So that's about as much as we have time for, or frankly, we've gotten to the end of the letter. Might as well call that and quit. Do you have any thoughts, questions? Conseil?
I was going to ask a question about the food, whether it relates only to the feast, or when Paul said about it's okay if somebody invited you over
Right.
and eating, you can eat the meat there, but
Yeah.
you couldn't participate. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, yeah, Paul, when he was dealing with the Corinthians question about eating meat sacrificed to idols, what he said was there's nothing innately corrupting about eating meat sacrificed to idols. It's just meat, and idols are nothing. You know, it's not like, you know, suddenly there's a magic curse on the meat, and if you eat it, that curse will come on you or something. It's not, there's no power in that meat sacrificed to idols to threaten you or hurt you. But he did say when it comes to going into the feasts, that's not right. He told them not to actually go into the feasts of the idol feast. But he said if someone invites you over for dinner, you don't have to worry about whether the food they're serving is something they bought in the marketplace that was remnants of an animal sacrificed to idols. Or even if you buy food in the market, just go ahead and buy food. Don't ask any questions about it. It's just, you know. See, because the Jews who were careful not to eat things that were unclean, when they lived in Gentile lands like this, they couldn't trust that the Gentile butchers, first of all, would have drained all the blood out like the Jews have to do. Secondly, they couldn't be sure that the meat on sale had not been sacrificed to idols, because there's such a surplus. So many animals were sacrificed to idols. Only a small portion was burned on the altar. The rest was sold or eaten into these feasts. So in a pagan land, anyone just trying to buy meat at the store or joining someone at their house for a meal, being served meat, they wouldn't really know, is this something that was sacrificed to idols or not? And Paul's saying, don't be like the Jews, don't be superstitious about it. It's not, you know, if you accidentally or whatever ingest meat that was sacrificed to idols, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. But of course, going into an idolatrous feast to eat that meat is obviously a different thing. And he said, if someone invites you over and they're not a Christian and they're serving meat, he said, don't even ask whether it's sacrificed to idols. Don't make an issue of it. But he said, if they mention to you, oh, by the way, this was sacrificed to idols, he said, then don't eat it. Not because you can't eat such meat, but because they mentioned it to you thinking that should be an issue to you. Thinking that, will you eat this if you know this is meat sacrificed to idols? Like they think maybe you should, and if you did eat it, it would stumble them. He said, don't eat it then. All right?